My wife's best friend called me and told me she'd gone to the company gala with her lover, so I decided to go, and there I saw them together. I never thought I'd experience something like this. She looked stunning, wearing the red dress I'd bought myself for our last wedding anniversary, her hair styled like it was on those nights I'd made a point of looking at her as if it were the first time. But the look she gave that man, a look full of desire, of intimacy, it was as if I'd never existed. I watched them for a few seconds, frozen, my heart pounding like a drum, my breath caught in my chest. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't just a physical betrayal, it was a betrayal of the soul, a stab in the history we'd built together. And when I approached, she smiled, thinking I was there for her. She truly believed that moment still belonged to me. But no. There, in front of everyone, I looked her in the eyes and said, "Since you prefer to go to parties with another man, I'm going to get out of your life," and then I placed the divorce papers in her hands. The expression on her face was something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Her mouth was half open, her eyes immediately welling up, as if reality had suddenly fallen from the sky and landed on her lap. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to touch me, but I backed away. And as I walked away, I felt every eye at the party turn to me, but by that moment, I was already numb. It was as if nothing else existed around me. Just the dull pain of seeing the woman I loved, or thought I loved, dissolve into tears over something she herself caused. The cruelest thing is that I didn't cheat on her. Never. In so many years together, even when our marriage went through cold spells, even when work exhausted me, or when she seemed distant, I never stopped believing it was still love. I made plans, prepared surprises, invested our family time, tried to rekindle the fire, but in the end, she was already in another world. A world where I was just a supporting character. And what hurt the most was realizing that this betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was premeditated. Calculated. She planned that night, chose the dress, left the house giving me a warm kiss, looking into our children's eyes as if everything was okay, as if what she did that night wouldn't ruin everything we had built. Returning home was like crossing a minefield. Our children slept, oblivious to the gathering storm. I entered the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and remained there, silent, staring at the family photograph on the dresser. That image frozen in time, of genuine smiles, of promises of eternity. I cried like a child. And then I made the decision to start over. Not out of pride. But out of sanity. Out of self-respect. She came back the next day trying to explain the inexplicable. She spoke of neediness, of phases, of confusion. She said she loved me. That it was just a moment of weakness. But there is no weakness in what is built on desire, on secrets, on deception. Weakness is lying while looking into the eyes of someone who only wanted to love you. Over the next few months, she tried everything to make amends. She called, texted, wrote letters that mixed guilt and longing, and in every letter, she asked to see her children. They were hurt, confused, too. The betrayal didn't hit me alone, it swept through the entire fabric of our family. And even though I never said anything bad about her to the children, they knew. Children feel it. They notice the silences, the absences, the pain in their eyes. And she felt the weight of it when she tried to see them for the first time and was met with coldness. One of our children hid in his room and wouldn't come out. She cried, begged, tried to justify herself, but there was a wall between them. A wall she built herself brick by brick, with every lie, every absence, every excuse she made. Time passed. I rebuilt myself. I started therapy, invested time in my projects, and one day, unexpectedly, I met a woman who had no idea about my story. She arrived slowly, without making any promises. She simply listened to me. She respected me. She made me laugh when I thought I would never be able to again. And little by little, she made me feel alive again. I didn't need to compare or seek replacements. It was something new, clean. It wasn't revenge. It was love. And that's how I knew the page had been turned. But when she, the mother of my children, discovered I had moved on, that there was another woman making me happy, it was as if her world fell apart. She came to me, desperate, saying she still loved me, that she would do everything differently if she had another chance, that she couldn't accept that she had lost what she loved most because of a mistake. And for the first time, I saw true regret in her. It wasn't just wounded pride. It was real pain. She wanted to see her children again, and this time they accepted. Little by little, they rebuilt a relationship, with limitations, with care, but without rancor. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it soothed the wounds. And even through tears and silence, they found a new way to connect. She asked me for forgiveness too. And I did. Because holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. But forgiveness doesn't mean getting back. I was already in a different situation, with another woman, and she understood. It hurt, of course. She cried. But she accepted it. And she finally began to stand on her own 2 feet. She started working with something she loved, attending support groups, and reconnecting with herself. It was beautiful to see, despite everything. But to this day, there's something she doesn't know, something that happened that night, at the party, something that made me make the final decision without hesitation. A detail hidden in a gesture, a phrase, a look. A secret I've carried with me ever since. Something that turned a betrayal into a final point of no return. Do you think the betrayal itself is the worst part? Maybe not. Sometimes the most devastating part isn't the act itself, but what it reveals about who we were to the other person. And what did I see that night that made me hand over the divorce papers without thinking twice? Maybe now is the time to tell. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and will never support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but based on situations extremely realistic, created to show how betrayal can destroy entire lives, families and futures. Prepare yourself. You are about to hear a shocking story, intense and full of twists and turns. Good story. And may this lesson never be experienced by you. Samuel and Elena met in their early 20s, in a small, unassuming cafe frequented by college students and young professionals seeking a moment of silence between a hectic schedule and dreams still emerging. He was a recent engineering graduate, she had just started her career in the marketing department of a multinational company. There was no cinematic moment, no stumble followed by passionate glances, but there was something they both always remembered fondly, a sincere conversation about trivial matters, but it flowed as if they had known each other for years. The connection was natural, unhurried, without games. Soon, they were sharing Sundays, then breakfasts, and before they knew it, it no longer made sense to go their separate ways. Samuel was the kind of man who carried with him a rare serenity. Always very focused, he never raised his voice, preferred to listen before speaking, and possessed an almost imperturbable patience, which contrasted with Elena's intensity. She was driven by passion in everything she did. Ambitious, expressive, with a contagious sparkle in her eyes. It was not uncommon for her to become heated in arguments, speak with her hands, and gesture wildly, while he, on the contrary, remained firm, listening to every word, pondering before responding. Perhaps it was this dynamic between them that made their relationship evolve so solidly. Friends said they complemented each other. Family members referred to them as the ideal couple, the kind that inspires, the kind that makes you believe that true love still exists. When they decided to get married, they had already been living together for 3 years. The wedding was simple, but full of meaning. They forgoed big parties, opting for an intimate dinner with close friends, and what most marked that night wasn't the speeches or the food, but the look they exchanged when they said yes. It seemed they said much more than those words could express. It was a silent promise to build something lasting, to face difficulties with maturity, to not give up on the hard days. And those days came, as in any marriage. They came with piling bills, with crises at work, with sleepless nights because of their young children. But they also came with victories, with achievements, with plans taking shape. They came with family trips, with midnight dinners after the kids were asleep, with complicit laughter on the living room sofa. They had 2 children, Lucas and Sophia. He, the eldest, was always a sensitive and observant boy, the kind who senses silence even before words. She, restless and energetic, defiant from a young age, but with a sweet heart. Samuel was a present father, involved in every stage of their upbringing, from diaper changes to school meetings. He never shied away from his role as educator, but he also knew how to be a comfort. Elena, despite her intense workload, always sought to balance her professional life with motherhood. She was the one who prepared snacks with love notes, who organized birthday parties, who thrilled with school performances as if they were theater premieres. They had a rhythm in which, even with difficulties, love seemed to be the center of everything. As the years passed, life molded itself into everyday life. Samuel grew professionally, taking on a prominent position at an environmental engineering firm. He spent many hours away from home, but tried to make up for it on weekends. Elena, in turn, gained prominence within the company where she worked. She rose quickly, became respected in the market, invited to important events, crucial meetings, and corporate trips. Success, however, brought pressure. She needed to be impeccable at all times, deal with political games, and maintain results. Samuel understood, or at least tried. He was never the type to demand presence or attention, but sometimes, in the silence of the early morning, he wondered if he was still part of Elena's world. She, on the other hand, felt guilty for not being able to be there as much as she would have liked. She loved what she did, but sometimes the pace wore her down. And in the few moments she was home, she tried to make up for it by being a loving mother and a dedicated wife, even if exhausted. Samuel noticed the effort and appreciated it. He often told her, with a calm smile, that he was proud, that he knew how hard she worked to keep everything in balance. The children felt it too. Even when they were young, they noticed when their mother was away for longer periods of time and reacted differently. Lucas would become quiet, more introspective. Sophia would become impatient, moody. But when Elena was with them, she was whole. She made a point of being there, present, disconnected from her cell phone, connected with her children. The couple's relationship, despite the tensions caused by the demands of modern life, remained functional. There were no constant fights, no cheating, no yelling. What existed was the passage of time, routine, adjustments, and a mutual attempt to keep what they had built alive. They had plans for the future, they talked about traveling when their children were older, buying a house in the countryside, slowing down. Samuel still wrote letters to Elena on special occasions, though over time she stopped responding with the same intensity. He didn't demand it. That more practical, more objective way was hers. But he kept all her letters, including the old ones from the time when they were still discovering themselves. Over the years, mutual admiration replaced passion. Not that love had died, but it had transformed. There was no longer that impulsive desire of the beginning, but there was respect, care, companionship. They slept hand in hand, shared coffee, talked about their children, work, politics, and even the weather. There was comfort, stability, a sense of home. And for Samuel, that was enough. He didn't crave explosive emotions, he didn't yearn for adventures. All he wanted was to be with her, to watch her grow, to see her happy, and to know she was with someone she could count on. Elena also valued this partnership, though sometimes she missed something she couldn't quite name. Something that perhaps had to do with the woman she had stopped being. Sometimes she looked in the mirror and wondered where that lighter, more spontaneous version of herself had gone. Still, the two remained together, connected by their children, their shared past, and the good times they still cherished. They celebrated their wedding anniversaries with discreet dinners, laughed while watching old movies, and on holidays, they often visited the same small town where they'd spent their honeymoon. It was a refuge from times when everything seemed simpler. Their children grew up, and with them, new challenges arose, adolescence, their own opinions, family conflicts. But they faced it all together, as a team. No one, looking from the outside, would have guessed any flaws there. They were considered an example of a stable couple, dedicated parents, people who managed to balance professional and personal life. Even among their friends, they were seen as models of mature relationships. Those who, even in the face of storms, knew how to anchor the ship. Samuel, with his calm, Elena, with her strength, made an admirable couple. But sometimes, storms don't come from outside. Sometimes, they form in the silence, in the spaces between one sentence and the next, in the accumulation of unsaid words, in the sum of small distances. Nothing was visible yet. There was no suspicion, no fighting, no clear signs that anything might change. It was just life going on, with its demands, its burdens, its pressures. A life where love wasn't shouted, but lived in the details. In the coffee Samuel made every day. In the note Elena left in the children's lunchboxes. In the hurried hugs before leaving for work. In the family's Sunday dinners. Everything seemed in order. Until one day, something imperceptible began to move. A gesture that went unnoticed, a look that lingered a second too long, an absence that stretched beyond the norm. Nothing scandalous. Nothing that signaled an abyss. But it was the beginning of a curve. The kind you only notice when you're already halfway down, desperately trying to slow down. But for now, everything was as usual. The home remained warm. The children continued to smile. The promises, even if dormant, were there. Sleeping between the sheets, hanging on the walls in picture frames, alive in the memories of good times. And that's where the story begins. When everything seems fine. When there's still hope. When hearts, even silent, still beat to the same rhythm. When there's no sorrow, just routine. When life, even in its imperfection, is still love. But until when? The months that followed that carefully constructed lull were, for the most part, unremarkable to outsiders. Samuel continued to work long hours, increasingly involved in an environmental restructuring project that required him to concentrate and travel briefly to nearby regions. Elena, for her part, gained even more notoriety within the company. Her team grew, her reports impressed the board, and invitations to corporate events became frequent. Whenever she received a new call, she communicated naturally, almost automatically, and Samuel, as always, encouraged her, offering support without question. He believed in her. In her ethics. In her integrity. In her love. The children's routine remained vibrant, noisy, and full of everyday moments, the kind that slip away from memory but form the foundation of a family: Sunday lunches, afternoons of drawing and homework, small school victories celebrated with cake bought at the bakery. Everything seemed in order, even for Elena, who, though sometimes feeling distant from herself, still found comfort at home, in her children's hugs, in Samuel's constant gaze, who, even tired, never seemed to hold back on affection. However, there was an uneasiness growing inside her that was silently growing, almost imperceptible, like a crack in the concrete. It was a feeling of absence, a restlessness I couldn't name. As if everything was too perfect, too controlled, and she, in her restless soul, was beginning to yearn for an imbalance that would make her feel alive again. It was on one of those nights when he returned home late from work, after a meeting with the executive team, that everything began to change. One of the company's new managers, Raphael, had recently been hired to lead a strategic area. Intelligent, articulate, experienced, and with a refined sense of humor, he quickly won over his colleagues and became a regular presence at the most important events. Elena and he exchanged few words in the first few weeks, always cordial and professional, until, at an informal get-together between directors and managers, she laughed at something he said, and that laugh stayed. It stayed in the room, in his eyes, in the gesture of pulling out his chair for her to sit. It stayed in the way they continued talking even when the bar emptied. The conversation that night was non-committal. They talked about management, careers, children, business trips. But there was a subtle tension, a silent electricity that lingered between words, between lingering glances. When they said goodbye, a light touch on her hand was enough to ignite a spark Elena tried to ignore. She returned home with her mind racing, her heart beating at a strange rhythm, as if she were returning from a place she shouldn't have visited. Samuel was already asleep, as were her children. She entered quietly, slowly took off her shoes, and stood before the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection as if trying to recognize the woman she was in that moment. The following days were marked by occasional professional encounters. Raphael began approaching her more frequently, suggesting ideas, seeking her opinion with an interest that transcended hierarchy. Elena, even trying to maintain control, began to feel drawn in. It wasn't about beauty, nor carnal desire. It was about being noticed. Listened to. Admired in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. With Samuel, the love was constant but predictable. Raphael, however, offered something new. A new kind of attention. An admiration without history, without past, without promises. Only the present, intense and uncommitted. Still, she resisted for weeks. She avoided being alone with him, avoided prolonging unnecessary conversations, avoided losing herself in the game of seduction that, even without direct words, was already taking place between them. It was during preparations for the company's gala, an annual event where all senior management gathered to celebrate results and network with investors, that Raphael invited her to accompany him. Elena hesitated. She said she was still deciding whether to go. He responded with an enigmatic smile, an "I hope so" loaded with meaning. At home, she told Samuel that she would have this commitment, as she had so many years before. He listened naturally, wished her good luck, and asked if she needed him to take care of the children's dinner. She nodded with a brief kiss and a thank you. There was no trace of suspicion in his eyes. Not a shadow of doubt. The day before the event, Elena was restless. She chose her dress with more care than usual, spent hours trying on outfits, and even as she put on her makeup, she felt an unusual excitement. It wasn't guilt yet. It was adrenaline. It was the anticipation of something I didn't yet know what it would be. She left early, saying she was stopping by a friend's house so they could go together. Samuel trusted her, as always. The children hugged her, wished her good night, and went back to drawing on the couch. That night, watching her leave, Samuel couldn't imagine it would be the last time he would look at his wife the way he had for years. The party was elegant. The decor was impeccable, the guests were well dressed, and speeches were being made on stage while bottles of sparkling wine circulated among the tables. Raphael was waiting for her at the entrance. When he saw her, he took her hand, discreetly complimented her appearance, and led her to a reserved table. They both looked stunning. And from that moment on, the night went in a direction there was no turning back. They danced. They laughed. They exchanged subtle confidences. The touch became constant. The distance grew smaller and smaller. And when everyone was already intoxicated by the wine and the dance music, he pulled her by the hand toward one of the hall's side corridors. Elena hesitated for a second, but went. The kiss happened there, muffled by the velvet-covered walls, enveloped in the scent of the moment, in the whispers exchanged that said everything without needing to explain anything. At that same time, elsewhere in the city, Samuel was putting his children to bed and planning a little surprise. He went through the box where he kept old mementos, found a card Elena had written for their 10th wedding anniversary, and felt a tightness in his chest. He considered sending a message telling her how much he loved her, but preferred to wait for her to arrive. He thought a gesture in person would carry more weight. Little did he know that, at that very moment, his wife was surrendering to another man. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But by choice. A silent choice, shrouded in a veil of euphoria, as if everything else didn't exist. As if nothing else mattered beyond that stolen moment. The next morning, Elena returned home. She showered, made coffee, and packed Sophia's backpack. She acted as if the previous night had been just another work event. Samuel watched her tenderly, asked if everything was okay, and she smiled. She said everything was great, tiring, but rewarding. He believed her. As always. But there was a new detail in her eyes. A hesitation between sentences. A silence where before there had been fluidity. A small shift in her gaze that Samuel couldn't interpret, but which awakened something dormant in him. For the first time, he wondered if everything was truly okay. Time passed. Elena kept in touch with Raphael discreetly but consistently. It wasn't daily, nor explicit. But it was consistent enough to keep what had begun alive. Meetings in distant cafes, coded messages, little escapades during breaks. All still shrouded in the illusion that it wasn't serious, that nothing would be discovered, that she could control her boundaries. Samuel, little by little, began to notice absences. Unanswered phone calls. Mood swings. And even without proof, something inside him began to scream. The trigger came one Friday afternoon when he received an unexpected call. Elena's best friend, who had long avoided intruding, decided to speak up. His voice was shaky. He apologized, saying he couldn't keep it in any longer. He bluntly revealed that Elena wasn't where she said she was, and that at the last company party, she was seen arriving with Raphael, and more than that, leaving with him hours later in a reserved car. Samuel listened in silence. He said nothing. He simply thanked her and hung up. And in that moment, everything inside him stopped. As if time had stopped. His breath became shallow, his hands cold. He went to the closet and took out an envelope tucked away in the back of the drawer. Inside was a divorce letter he'd written months earlier, as a precaution, during a time when he'd feared the relationship would deteriorate. He'd never considered using it. Until that moment. That night, she dressed soberly, calmly fixed her hair, and drove to the company's season-ending party. Elena was there. Radiant. Beside Raphael. Smiling. Carefree. And as he approached, she felt as if she were watching a movie from a parallel life. When she saw him, her eyes widened. Her world stopped. And there, in front of everyone, with a firm voice, Samuel held out the envelope to her. And he said only what was necessary. It was at that moment that the truth tore everything apart. But what Samuel discovered next, was yet to come. The envelope fell from Elena's hands as if it had burned her fingers, and the eyes around her fell into a thick silence, a kind of judgment that needed no words. Raphael tried to mask the sudden tension, but his face hardened into a mixture of alertness and cowardice. Elena, breathing heavily, tried to call Samuel's name, but he was already walking away, his steps firm, his eyes tearless. What she didn't know was that that final gesture, that envelope handed there, in front of everyone, hadn't been just an act of breaking up. It was the culmination of everything Samuel had discovered, and had chosen to keep silent until that moment. It wasn't the betrayal itself that destroyed the marriage. It was what she revealed. It was what lay behind it. What she never imagined he knew. During the days that followed that night, Elena tried every means possible to contact him. She sent long messages, full of excuses, and begged for answers. Samuel remained silent. Not out of coldness, but out of a vital need to avoid drowning in the chaos of emotions. For the first time in her life, she felt unable to control her feelings. It was as if their entire history had been tainted by a shadow that could no longer be ignored. And it was on a cloudy Sunday, when the children were with their grandparents and he was alone, that Elena appeared at the door. Her eyes were puffy, her face drawn, a weariness that seemed to permeate her bones. He stared at her silently, took a step back, and allowed her to enter. They sat in the living room, side by side, but as distant as strangers. Elena began to speak, her words tumbling, saying it had been a mistake, that she hadn't planned anything, that it was all a mess. But he raised his hand and, for the first time in years, cut her off softly. He told her she needed to listen before speaking. She nodded silently, her eyes welling up. Samuel then stood, went to the bookshelf, and picked up the framed photo of them on their wedding anniversary, the same one that had previously stood beside the bed. He held it for a few seconds, looked straight into her eyes, and said it wasn't the betrayal that had destroyed him most, but what he saw that night, minutes before handing her the envelope. Elena frowned in confusion, and he continued. She said she arrived at the party earlier than she expected. That she watched her from afar for a few minutes, without her noticing. And that there, in that interval of time, she saw something she would never be able to erase from her memory. She saw Raphael kneeling before her with a glass of wine in his hand, making a toast that, to those far away, seemed like some kind of intimate celebration. He saw her smile with a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. But that wasn't it. It was the moment she removed a small chain from her neck and placed it in Raphael's hand, with a sweet smile. That chain wasn't just any chain. It was the first one Samuel had given her, when they were still dating, and she swore to wear it like a charm. She said it was her luck. Her keepsake. Her bond with him. And there, in that gesture, she gave it to the other. It wasn't an object. It was everything. It was the symbol of what they had been. Given like someone giving a promise to a new destiny. Elena gasped. She tried to explain that it was an impulse, that it didn't mean what it seemed, that she never wanted to erase the past. But Samuel interrupted her again. He said he didn't need to hear any more excuses. That he didn't hate her, but that he had understood, in that moment, that she had been gone for a long time. That her body was present, but her soul was no longer with him. And that he, too, had left, emotionally, from that second he saw the chain handed over to the other man. It was in that moment, not in the physical betrayal, that the bond broke forever. He said forgiveness would come, in time, but not return. That there were scars that didn't hurt, but also didn't allow for new beginnings. Elena cried unabashedly. She sobbed. She tried to speak through spasms of pain, saying she couldn't explain why she did it, that perhaps it was the weight of years piling up, that perhaps she'd lost herself in the process of trying to be everything to everyone. That she never stopped loving him, but that she failed. And that, watching him leave that night, something inside her died. She said that in the following days she realized the emptiness of the gesture, the regret that suffocated her every morning. But now it was too late, she knew. What she asked for wasn't to return, but to be forgiven. To be looked in the eyes once more, as someone who was still human, even after her mistake. Samuel remained silent for long seconds. Then he took a deep breath, held her hand, and said she would always be the mother of their children. That he recognized the effort, the pain, and that he didn't wish her ruin. But now, he needed to tell the truth he'd kept hidden all this time. He got up, went to his office, and returned with a folder. Inside were documents, photos, messages. Elena frowned in confusion. He then explained that Raphael, the man she'd gotten involved with, was married. With children. And that his wife, upon finding out everything, hired an investigator. The contents of that folder were what had been uncovered. But more than that, Raphael's wife was the sister of one of Samuel's colleagues. And she was the one who told him everything, in detail, long before he received the call from Elena's best friend. He'd known about the betrayal weeks before. He knew everything. But he didn't say a word. He waited. He watched. And he planned. Elena went pale. Her hands were shaking. She said she had no idea. That Raphael had said he was divorced, that he lived alone. Samuel nodded, saying he believed her. That Raphael was experienced in this, that he'd done it before. But what she needed to know was that everything was about to come to light. His wife, hurt and furious, decided to expose everything publicly. He had already shared some of the evidence with the company's legal department and family groups. The bomb was about to explode. Samuel handed her the folder, said he wouldn't stop her from defending herself, but that she needed to be prepared. He said he didn't wish her destruction, but that actions always came with consequences. And that it wasn't his place to protect something that no longer existed. Elena collapsed. She fell to her knees on the living room floor, her face in her hands, begging for a way to stop everything. She said her children couldn't know. She didn't want to lose them. She would do anything. But Samuel said, regretfully, that it was no longer her turn to decide what would happen next. That now, everything depended on the decisions of others. And that, although he would never turn his children against their mother, he couldn't stop them, once they knew everything, from making their own choices. He had made his. And now she would have to face hers. It was at that moment that she understood the depth of what had happened. It wasn't just an extramarital affair. It was the loss of everything that gave her identity meaning. It was the shame, the exposure, the disappointment in her children's eyes. It was the man's love she had destroyed. It was the chain handed to the wrong hands. It was the fall. And there was no way back to the top. That late afternoon, as she left the house that was no longer hers, Elena felt she finally saw everything she hadn't wanted to see. The impulsive choices, the ignored signs, the scorned love. And Samuel, as he closed the door, felt, for the first time in a long time, the pain beginning to transform into something lighter. Not joy. Not yet. But peace. And that, for him, was already a beginning. But what Elena didn't yet know was that the path to redemption would be longer than she imagined. That before she could regain anything, she would have to face not only the judgment of others, but especially that of her own conscience. And that reconstruction would begin when she least expected it, at the hands of someone she never imagined would extend a gesture of love to her. The days that followed were marked by an awkward silence, thick as a smokescreen that hung over everything. Elena withdrew from everything and everyone, turned off social media, avoided her coworkers, and retreated into herself, trying to understand at what point she stopped being that admired and respected woman and became the center of a scandal about to explode. With each notification on her phone, her heart raced as if it were a sentence, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. She could no longer sleep. She paced the house alone, her eyes red, and for the first time, that spacious, sophisticated apartment she had decorated with such care seemed like nothing more than an empty stage, colorless, soundless, lifeless. Silence was now her only companion, and within it, the screams of her own conscience never ceased. Raphael's wife didn't wait long. The dossier was sent to the Human Resources Department, to the board, and also to family groups. There were no threats, no calls for revenge, just a direct and factual report of everything that had been discovered, screenshots of messages, photos, statements. Elena received the communication from HR on a Monday morning, was called to a closed-door meeting, and even before entering, she knew what awaited her. She sat before two directors and a representative from the legal department. The conversation was short, cold, and painful. They informed her that, given the evidence and the inappropriate conduct involving a compromised colleague, the company would have no choice but to terminate her employment. She didn't cry. She simply bowed her head, thanked them for the opportunity, and walked out of the room with slow steps, knowing that everyone in the hallway had already read, heard, and commented on her. She descended the stairs to the ground floor as if walking through rubble. She passed the reception area without looking up, her bag firmly on her shoulders, as if it were the only support she had left. Outside, the sun shone harshly, a stark contrast to what she carried inside. She started the car, but couldn't turn the key. She stood there, hands on the steering wheel, trying to breathe. A tear fell, then another, until the tears came like an inevitable rupture. She no longer wept for the loss of her job, nor for the public shame. She wept for the loss of herself. For the woman she had allowed to die without realizing it. In the following days, he tried calling Samuel. Not to beg, but to apologize. The calls went to voicemail. He sent short, sincere, and undramatic messages. He saw them, but didn't respond. It was as if I were already somewhere else, not only physically distant, but emotionally inaccessible. Elena then decided to write a letter. Long, raw, unfiltered. She wrote about the fears she felt, about the ego that blinded her, about the vanity of being desired, admired. About the emptiness she carried and tried to fill in the most misguided way. He asked for forgiveness, not strategically, but out of necessity. He asked for forgiveness like someone asking for air. And he also asked that, if he ever felt ready, he'd tell his children his side of the story. Because she couldn't bear to see them grow up hating her. That same week, Samuel took the children away for a few days, to a small coastal town where they often went on vacation. The trip wasn't planned as an escape, but as a respite. He needed to reconnect with his children, understand how they were taking everything in. Lucas, the older boy, had already sensed something serious had happened. He didn't ask direct questions, but his silences screamed louder than any questioning. Sophia, the younger boy, alternated between crying fits and forced smiles. Samuel knew, watching them, that the time would come to tell them the truth. But not now. Not yet. They needed to feel that their world hadn't completely collapsed. Upon returning home, the children noticed changes. Some photos had been removed from the walls. The guest room was more organized, with women's clothing removed. Their mother's presence was gone, but her traces were still everywhere. The smell in the closet, the books on the shelf, the notes Sophia had kept in the little blue box. Samuel sat with them in the living room, asked them to listen carefully, and told them only what was necessary, that he and their mother were separated, that this would not change their love for them, and that they would continue to be present parents. Lucas said nothing. He just nodded and went upstairs to his room. Sophia asked if their mother would come see them, and Samuel said yes, that she loved them and would see them whenever they wanted. He didn't mention guilt. He didn't mention betrayal. He let his words carry the weight of truth, but without the poison of bitterness. 2 weeks later, Elena wrote directly to her children. A note for each of them. Delivered by Samuel, carefully folded, without perfume, without artifice. Just words written with her heart exposed. In both, she said she was sorry, that she had hurt the family with her choices, and that she would understand if they took a while to forgive her. She asked them never to stop being who they were because of her. She said she loved them more than life itself, and that she would always be there, even from afar. Sophia read it, crying, hugging her father. Lucas took longer. He kept the note in his backpack for days, until one day, without saying a word, he wrote back. A simple notebook page. He said he was sad, but that he didn't hate her. That he still wanted to see her, but needed some time. When Elena read it, sitting on the edge of the bed in the room that was now hers alone, she felt a spark of hope. Not of reconciliation. But of humanity. Time passed, as it always does, albeit slowly. Samuel returned to work, resumed his routine with his children, but there was something new in his demeanor. A more attentive gaze, a more selective silence. He was more introspective, but not bitter. He found peace in small things, a walk in the park with Sophia, a mature conversation with Lucas about technology, a hot coffee in the late afternoon. And it was precisely at this cafe, on an afternoon of light rain, that he met Mariana. A discreet woman, a literature professor, sitting nearby with a book of old poetry. They exchanged few words, but there was a lightness to their encounter. Something unhurried, with no hidden agendas. Just presence. They began seeing each other frequently, always in quiet settings, almost always with the children. Mariana didn't ask too many questions. She didn't try to fix anything. She simply offered company. And, over time, it became affection. Samuel didn't tell his children right away. He waited for the right moment. When he did, carefully, they both reacted differently. Sophia was excited, curious. Lucas remained silent for days, but then, at a Saturday lunch, he asked if she was nice. Samuel smiled. He said yes. And Lucas nodded, making room. It was the beginning of something new. No pressure. No comparisons. Just a new story beginning to be written. Elena learned of the new relationship through her own children. She wasn't surprised, but she felt the impact. Not jealousy, but reality. It sealed the end of the chapter she still insisted on revisiting. She cried alone, once again. But at the same time, she understood that part of the forgiveness she sought was allowing Samuel to be happy without her. She called him that night, after weeks without any direct contact. His voice was calm. They spoke few words. She thanked him for taking care of the children, for never poisoning them against her. He replied that that was the least of it. That they were not to blame for anything. Elena then asked, with a trembling voice, if she could see them this weekend. He agreed. And said that, if they wanted, she could see them any time. The following Saturday, Elena arrived with a cake she had baked. Her children welcomed her with shy but sincere hugs. They sat in the living room, talked, and laughed. For the first time since everything, they were together again, albeit in a new configuration. Samuel remained nearby, observing. There was no tension, only maturity. A silent understanding that, despite everything, the family existed. Changed, yes. But alive. And it was at that meeting that Elena understood what it truly meant to start over. It wasn't about winning Samuel back, nor trying to erase the past. It was about accepting the weight of one's mistakes, without making excuses. It was about looking one's children in the eye and knowing that, despite everything, it was still possible to build something with dignity. Not what was lost, but something new. Something that arose from truth, acceptance, and surrender. In the days that followed, Elena began volunteering at a support center for women in crisis. She told her story to other women, not to victimize herself, but to show how haste, ego, and vanity can destroy what's most valuable. She began dedicating part of her days to listening, counseling, and reaching out. It was her way of rebuilding herself. Samuel, now with Mariana and his children, relearned how to smile lightly. He discovered that love doesn't have to be a repetition, but an evolution. And he understood, over time, that forgiving isn't forgetting, but moving on in peace. But something was yet to happen. Something that would definitively change the way everyone viewed this story. And this moment would come not out of revenge, nor by chance, but by destiny. Because there are things that, even unplanned, need to happen for the cycle to complete. The silent reconfiguration of everyone's lives involved a kind of reconstruction that couldn't be done in a hurry, nor with promises. It was like learning to walk again after a fall that broke not only bones but also trust. From that last encounter between Elena and her children, a new dynamic was established, fragile but true, in which every gesture carried the weight of caution, but also the possibility of rebirth. There were no major conversations between her and Samuel after that, and perhaps there wasn't even a need. Everything had already been said with their eyes, with silences, with carefully established boundaries. They now coexisted as two adults who had learned the hard way that love alone is not enough when respect disappears. Still, there was a new form of consideration between them, mature, clean, built not on the rubble of what had been, but on the ruins they had agreed to leave behind. Elena began to see her children more often, initially at set times, then with more freedom. Gradually, she returned to the simple moments, taking Sophia to the park, helping Lucas with a school project, preparing a special lunch on some weekends. But even in those moments, her absence was felt. They welcomed her with affection, but everything was filtered. As if even affection needed to pass through a protective barrier that hadn't existed before. And it hurt. Not because it was unfair, but because it was genuine. Elena knew that love wasn't enough. She had to prove, day after day, that she was still worthy of their presence. And this effort wasn't made with words, but with constancy, with humility, with the acceptance that perhaps some scars were eternal, even if they no longer bled. Samuel, for his part, continued his journey serenely, but also attentively. Mariana had become a real part of their routine, not only as his companion, but as someone who, with rare sensitivity, understood the limits of a space where so much memory still lingered. She didn't try to occupy any space, didn't demand prominence. Her love manifested itself in her listening, her calm presence, her welcoming gaze. The children had developed their own relationship with her, without impositions, but also without coldness. It was as if Mariana, in her delicacy, had entered their lives quietly, respecting each step as if it were sacred territory. And perhaps that was why she was so well received. The stability that seemed to finally be consolidating, however, began to be shaken by a new dilemma that imposed itself with increasing force. Lucas, at 12, began asking more incisive questions. Not about the separation, but about the reasons why. He no longer wanted to simply understand that his parents had separated. He wanted to know what had really happened. He was too smart to accept empty answers. He began to question his mother's absence at certain events, the averted glances of adults, the whispers among family members. And with this, a new kind of tension arose, silent but corrosive. Samuel realized it would be impossible to maintain the integrity of his relationship with his children without telling the truth. But telling the truth inevitably meant opening a wound he had tried to protect at all costs. It meant casting Elena in a harsh light in front of his own children. And no matter how much hurt he still felt, he knew he didn't want to be the man who condemned their mother to contempt. Mariana realized this too. And, with her usual serenity, she suggested that the conversation take place between Elena and her children, freely, without him initiating it. Because only she could choose how to face that moral mirror. Elena received the news as an inevitable call. She knew this moment would come, but she didn't expect it to be so soon. She spent entire nights trying to formulate the right words. She wrote, erased, rewrote. But deep down, she knew no word would be perfect. And that's why, when the Sunday finally arrived when they would be alone, she decided to just speak. No script, no rehearsal, no filters. She sat across from Lucas and Sophia, eyes locked, her hands trembling, but her heart determined. She said she would make the hardest mistake of all, tell a truth that could drive them apart, but was necessary. And then she spoke. She spoke of the mistake, the betrayal, the confusion she had allowed herself to fall into. She didn't try to justify it. She simply said she had lost herself, that she couldn't deal with her own needs, and that she had deeply hurt their father, and consequently, the entire family. Sophia wept silently, not fully understanding, but sensing something heavy was happening. Lucas remained silent for several minutes. Then he got up and left the room. Elena didn't follow. She stayed there with Sophia in her arms, stroking her daughter's hair as if trying to keep alive the only part of herself that hadn't yet crumbled. When Lucas returned, his eyes brimming with tears, he simply asked why. There was no accusation in his voice. There was pain. And Elena answered with what was left, I don't know, but if I could go back, I would do everything differently. From that day on, their relationship changed again. It didn't worsen, but it transformed. Lucas began to maintain an emotional distance, not out of coldness, but out of defensiveness. Sophia, on the other hand, sought her mother's presence even more, as if she feared losing her again. Elena began to live between these two intensities, the cautious distance of one and the needy closeness of the other. And with each gesture, she understood that forgiveness wouldn't come all at once, but in installments. And that, perhaps, that would even be fairer. During this period, Elena received a job offer from an NGO that worked with vulnerable families. It was a lesser position, with a salary much lower than her previous earnings, but it would allow her to somehow give back to the world some of what she had learned from her own pain. She accepted without hesitation. And there, amidst real stories of overcoming, she felt she could, little by little, rebuild herself more honestly. Not as the woman she once was, but as someone new, shaped by the consequences of her own actions. Samuel followed this process from a distance, observing with respect but also with caution. There was no longer room for judgment. They had both followed different paths. He, alongside Mariana, saw a stable and mature relationship blossom, one that didn't depend on explosive passion, but on presence and partnership. With her, he rediscovered the pleasure of talking about the day, of planning short trips, of sharing silence without feeling empty. And this, more than anything else, proved to him that there was life after chaos. Even so, there was a final shadow hanging over everyone. Extended family, oldest friends, some uncles and grandparents, still treated Elena as a figure to be avoided, an embarrassing presence at events. There were judgmental looks, veiled phrases, withheld invitations. And this began to weigh on the children. Sophia once returned from lunch with her grandparents asking why her mother was no longer welcome at their home. Lucas, noticing that some friends were talking about his mother's story, began avoiding social gatherings. Samuel realized he needed to intervene. It was then that, at a family meeting organized by him and Mariana, with everyone present, he decided to speak. He asked for silence and stated firmly that he would no longer tolerate any indirect judgment of Elena. That her mistakes did not define her completely. That she was the mother of his children and deserved respect. He said that forgiveness was a choice for each person, but that living with children required maturity, and that no one, absolutely no one, had the right to deny them the right to love their own mother. There was silence. There were uncomfortable looks. But there was also agreement. Mariana, beside him, nodded silently, her hand on his, as if understanding that justice is also a gesture of love. After that encounter, many people's attitudes changed. Not all, but enough for Elena to return to family events without being treated like an unwelcome presence. And for her, this wasn't redemption. It was dignity. And that, more than any new beginning, was what she needed most. But even with this newfound stability, something was about to happen that would forever change everyone's understanding of what it meant to forgive. Because sometimes, you have to lose everything to understand what's truly worth keeping. And forgiveness doesn't always bring back what was lost, but it can open the door to something you haven't yet known. And that door was about to open, in a way no one expected. Elena watched from the window the reflection of a world that seemed to have moved on without her. The trees swayed lazily, children ran on the sidewalk, cars passed without noticing her presence there, behind the glass, a warm cup between her fingers. It had been over a year since everything had fallen apart, and although much had changed, inside her there were still noises that insisted on echoing, memories that arose unbidden, doubts that, despite all her efforts, had not been completely silenced. There was no longer any anger in her chest, nor any shame. What remained was a strange sense of lucidity, as if she had been through a hurricane and was now sweeping away the rubble with her bare hands, piece by piece, with no expectation that anything would ever return to the way it was, but with the subtle hope that at least it could be different. Better, perhaps. Real. That morning, she received a message from Samuel asking to talk. He suggested coffee at their usual spot, the one they'd last seen with their children before their final separation. Her heart raced as if she knew something important was coming, but it wasn't romantic anticipation, but rather the awareness that moments like these carry silent decisions. She arrived punctually and found him already seated, his expression calm, yet imbued with a certain solemnity. The exchange of glances between them was serene, almost affectionate, but there was a density in the air. He greeted her with a brief smile and said he needed to share something he'd been thinking about for weeks. Mariana had received a job offer in another city, about 2 hours away, an opportunity that would be very meaningful to her. And he was seriously considering accompanying her. Not to escape, but because he felt it was time to take a new step. Elena listened to everything with a tightness in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't jealousy, nor sadness. It was the final realization that the love she'd experienced with him was truly in the past, sealed, overcome. She felt an almost childish urge to ask him to stay, not for her, but for the children, for the closeness, for the routines. But she suppressed that reaction. She looked him in the eyes and asked what his children thought about it. Samuel explained that he'd spoken to Lucas and Sophia and that they'd reacted with surprising maturity. Sophia cried a little, as expected, but understood. Lucas, always more reserved, simply asked that it not be a permanent separation. He assured her he'd return on weekends and that he'd keep everything as it was regarding his presence as a father. Elena nodded silently. There was nothing to argue with. It was fair, it was dignified, it was life taking its course. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, sipping their coffee slowly, each lost in their own thoughts. Samuel then lightly touched her hand across the table and said, in an almost brotherly tone, that he was proud of the path she had taken after everything. That, despite the pain and loss, she had proven it was possible to start over. And that, while time couldn't heal everything, it could teach her how to breathe better. Elena smiled, her eyes welling up, and thanked him. She said that, deep down, a part of her always knew he would be the last person to hate her, even when everything indicated otherwise. And that, if I had had the wisdom I have today years ago, maybe everything would have been different. Samuel simply said that perhaps it wasn't about wisdom, but about time. Because some lessons only hurt from within when it's the soul itself that gets hurt. That same week, Elena hosted a dinner in her small apartment, now simply but cozily decorated. It was a ritual that was becoming more frequent, her children eating dinner with her, sharing laughter, listening to music while they washed the dishes. It was in these details that she felt something was being rebuilt. Even though the scars remained, there were new gestures, real spaces being filled by a bond that no longer depended on what had been, but on what they were willing to experience from then on. Lucas surprised her when, mid-meal, he asked her if she felt happy. Elena, taken aback, smiled and replied sincerely that, for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with who she was. And that maybe, just maybe, that was more important than the happiness she had once sought in the wrong places. Days later, an unexpected connection changed the course of everyone's lives again. It was Mariana, her voice tense, explaining that they had been in a minor accident on the road. Nothing serious, but they were in the hospital for observation. Samuel had crashed his car on a wet stretch of highway and, although conscious, had suffered a fractured shoulder. The children were apprehensive, and Elena readily offered to drive them there. The trip was silent, with Sophia holding her seatbelt and Lucas wearing headphones, but muted. Upon arrival, they found Mariana at the reception desk, red-eyed and visibly exhausted. Elena didn't hesitate, she hugged her tightly, as if understanding that life is made of pauses, but also of unthinkable reunions. When she saw Samuel in the room, bandaged but smiling, a wave of relief ran through Elena. Not because he was her ex-husband, but because he was the father of her children. The man who, despite everything, had taught her dignity. In the days that followed, Elena cared for the children while Mariana accompanied Samuel through his recovery. It was an unusual routine, a temporary arrangement, but one that allowed even stronger bonds to be strengthened. It was during this time that Lucas, in a nighttime conversation with his mother, told her he admired her. That, despite everything that had happened, he saw in her someone who had the courage to face the consequences. He said that many adults make mistakes and hide. She didn't. And that this was much more valuable than she imagined. Elena couldn't hold back her tears. That sentence was more than a compliment. It was the answer to all the sleepless nights, all the silences she'd swallowed, every time she'd felt like giving up. After Samuel returned home, already recovered, he invited Elena to dinner with them on a night when the children had insisted on cooking. It was strange, but natural. The four of them around the table, sharing a space that was no longer the same as before, but which now held respect, remembrance, and something approaching peace. Mariana, with her usual lightheartedness, made a point of including Elena in the conversation, in the comments, without forcing intimacy, but also without distancing. It was as if everyone had finally understood that love, in its purest form, can survive tragedy. Not conjugal love, perhaps. But the love between human beings who have made mistakes, suffered, and chosen not to destroy themselves completely. It was that night that Samuel called Elena to the balcony and, under a star-studded sky dimmed by the city lights, told her he intended to ask Mariana to marry him. He wanted to know how she felt about it, not for permission, but out of consideration. Elena, surprisingly, smiled lightly. She said that if there was anyone in the world she would trust her children with besides him, it was Mariana. And that she sincerely hoped they would be happy. Samuel was silent for a few seconds before saying that if she ever decided to love someone again, she hoped it would be someone capable of seeing the woman she had become, not the woman she was at her worst. That conversation sealed something between them. Not a new phase, nor a romantic rapprochement. But a silent pact of mutual respect, of possible admiration, of shared resilience. Each would follow a different path, but with the knowledge that they did what they could, when they could, with the tools they had. And that, perhaps, was the closest thing to redemption they could achieve. Elena returned home that night with a light heart. For the first time in a long time, there was no pain, guilt, or longing. There was only a pleasant silence, the kind of silence that only exists when one learns to live with the choices one made and the consequences that followed. She lay in bed, stared at the ceiling, and understood that, although she could never undo the past, she had transformed her present into something bearable, real, and meaningful. And even though the future was uncertain, she knew exactly who she was now. And that was all. But the story wasn't over yet. Because, as always, life saves its most powerful lessons for last, those that don't change what's past, but that forever change who you choose to be from now on. And that moment was closer than anyone imagined. The following month seemed to float at a different pace, as if time had finally understood it no longer needed to rush, just move forward. Life, reorganized along new lines, pulsed with less noise and more presence. Samuel and Mariana decided to celebrate their wedding intimately, with just their children and a few close friends, without ostentation, without long speeches, simply with the truth of what they had built together, a relationship born not of euphoria, but of maturity and peace. The ceremony took place outdoors, in the same place where years before he and Elena had picnicked with their children. But this time, there were no ghosts. Just genuine smiles, teary eyes, and a respectful silence that said more than any words. Elena was invited. She received the invitation with surprise and, for a moment, hesitated. Not out of pride, but out of fear of occupying a space that no longer belonged to her. However, after reflection, she decided to go. Not to make an appearance, but to close a cycle with dignity. She wore a sober dress, light makeup, and arrived with a small bouquet to personally present to the bride. Upon seeing Mariana, the two embraced with the delicacy of those who have shared pain, created from the same breaking point. Elena looked at Samuel from afar, and as their eyes met, they both smiled with the complicity of those who have survived. During the ceremony, the children stood between their parents, like living bridges that no longer connected two warring extremes, but continents that had learned to respect each other. A few days later, something happened. One of the women who frequented the volunteer center where Elena helped invited her to give a talk at a local public school. It was about emotional reconstruction after marital crises. Elena had never spoken in public since, but she decided to accept. She wanted to show that it was possible to rise again, even after destroying what she loved most. In that packed auditorium, before mothers, teachers, young women, and elderly women with weary looks, she spoke with an open heart. She didn't use scripts, she didn't hide her pain. She told her story with rawness and honesty. She admitted her mistakes, her impulses, her emotional blindness. But most importantly, she spoke about the price. About the silence of her children, about the empty gaze in the mirror, about the new beginning that drags on before moving forward. At the end of the talk, one of the women in the audience stood up, applauded, and said that, for the first time, she felt someone truly spoke to her. Elena cried. For the first time, her tears were not of guilt, but of healing. Lucas, now a teenager, chose to study abroad. He was accepted into a preparatory school in another state and, when saying goodbye to his mother at the airport, gave her a long hug. He told her he would always love her, not because she was perfect, but because she had learned to become a better person after the chaos. He said trust can't be rebuilt overnight, but that she was doing it. Elena watched him board the plane with tears in her eyes, but a peaceful heart. Sophia, increasingly resembling her mother in her way of looking at things, began attending art therapy sessions and creating drawings about families, fears, and new beginnings. Elena watched her closely, finally understanding that being a mother wasn't just about protecting, but also knowing how to ask for forgiveness. A few months passed, and unexpected news arrived like a calm hurricane. Raphael, the man with whom Elena had betrayed Samuel, had been arrested for involvement in a series of tax evasion cases and the use of confidential corporate information for personal gain. It was the scandal everyone at the company had feared years before, but no one had been able to prove. Now, with the investigations advanced, it was discovered that he had manipulated contracts and forged reports, benefiting financially at the company's expense. The revelation landed like a punch in the gut for Elena, not because of the surprise, but because it confirmed what perhaps, deep down, she had always known. She had not only destroyed her family for a momentary desire, but for someone who wore masks even when looking in the mirror. She felt a pang of shame, but this time, the feeling didn't crush her. It merely reinforced the lesson that time had been teaching her with brutal patience: when you betray true love, you often bet everything on emptiness disguised as intensity. From that point on, Elena decided to move to a simpler, quieter, more authentic neighborhood. She sold her car, started walking more, wearing less makeup, talking less, and listening more. She became a well-known figure there, respected for her stories of overcoming adversity, but also for her discreet way of being. Some afternoons, she wrote letters to herself, as reminders of what she no longer wanted to forget. One of them read, "I was a traitor, I was a fallen, I was forgotten. But I was also the one who decided to carry on. And sometimes, that's all it takes." Samuel and Mariana, after 2 years together, adopted a 5-year-old girl named Helena. She had been abandoned by her biological mother and had been living in foster homes since birth. When Samuel saw her eyes for the first time, he knew there was room in his heart for another life. When he told his children, Lucas was thrilled over the phone, and Sophia cried with joy. Elena, upon being told, hugged Mariana tightly. She said she couldn't imagine a luckier child than that, being raised by 2 people who knew exactly what it means to build a family. That adoption symbolized not only a new beginning for Helena, but also living proof that bonds don't have to be genetic to be real. They just need to be genuine. On a sunny Sunday, everyone gathered in the park: Samuel, Mariana, Elena, their 3 children, with blankets on the ground, sandwiches made by Sophia, and fresh fruit juice. It was a scene that, years ago, would have seemed improbable, perhaps even unbearable. But now it was a portrait of what remained after love was betrayed, forgiveness was forged, and the truth was faced without masks. Sitting there, laughing at silly jokes, playing cards, and listening to music on a small portable radio, they didn't seem like people who had weathered storms. They seemed like survivors aware of the value of levity. And perhaps that is the greatest reward for those willing to pay the price of fixing what was broken. Their story ends like this, without explosions, without forced romantic reconciliations, but with the power of transformation. Samuel found not only a new love, but a new way of being a man, a father, and a companion. Mariana proved that empathy can heal wounds she never even caused. Elena learned, the hard way, that betraying a heart is more than a mistake, it's a rupture with everything you are, and that rebuilding that requires more than forgiveness, it requires courage. And the children, oh, the children. They grew up in shadows and light, but they understood that their parents are neither heroes nor villains. They are human. They make mistakes, they fall, they get up, and when they're lucky, they learn. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important. And of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, because the stories here are powerful, real, and full of truths we often avoid facing. This story starkly shows us how betrayal doesn't just destroy a marriage. It destroys respect, erodes the foundation of a family, undermines self-esteem, alienates children, and causes us to lose what often took years to build. And even when there is forgiveness, what was lost cannot always be recovered. The pain of betrayal echoes in every suspicious look, every hesitant embrace, every burdened silence. Love requires courage, but betrayal requires coldness. And those who choose to betray rarely realize the price until it's too late. This channel does not support any type of betrayal here. Our stories exist so that, when you hear them, you remember to value those who love you, to protect your home, and to never throw away true love for a fleeting desire. Until the next story.